Good evening. I'm Robert Kesten, Executive Director of Stonewall National Museum, Archives, and Library. And this is a public program where we talk to an author whose book is either out recently or coming out. And it's our way of sharing information, cultural information, important literary information with the public, people who support Stonewall and people who are just interested in good literature. And today we're talking with Patrick Horrigan, and his book is called American Scholar. It is a novel, and it is definitely worth reading, worth keeping by your bedside and going back to a few times because of the complexities. It's interesting, Patrick. It's an easy read. It flows very well, but yet there's so many layers that you sometimes feel the need to go back just to see which period of time they're talking about. Are they talking about their lives? Are they talking about the lives of the people that they're studying? Are they actually living their lives, or are they trying to live their lives through some kind of mystical imagination of a past that may or may not have really existed? So how did you come to write this story? And before I finish, how much of it is based on the work of the people who came before it? Was that an inspiration for writing the book, or was that something that you found as you were writing the book?
One of the books that I had in mind when I was writing American Scholar is not a book that I would say is very similar to my novel, but it was one that was very important to me when I was in my early 20s. And it's a novel by, now I'm blanking on his name. It's called The Lost Language of Cranes.
Oh, yeah, I know who you're talking about.
It's terrible. I'm blanking on the author's name. But it was about a young gay man in New York City sort of finding his way, and it was sort of the right book at the right time. And it felt like, in some ways, it was my story. David Levitt, thank you. Someone just posted that. But American Scholar, the seed for this novel was planted when I was a graduate student in the late 1980s in New York City. I was doing American Studies at Columbia University, and I was taking a seminar on transcendentalism. I was studying Emerson and Thoreau and their circle. And the professor, who was very old school, recommended this book called American Renaissance, which was published in 1941. And it was by F.O. Matheson. And Matheson was considered one of the so-called founding fathers of American studies. He was very active in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I became intrigued by the novel. I thought the title was very sexy, American Renaissance. The thesis of the book is also very sexy. And very simply, the thesis of the book is that 19th century American literature can hold its own in relation to the great texts of world literature, both ancient and modern. And Matheson takes a handful of mid-19th century writers like Whitman and Thoreau and Emerson and Melville, and he relates them to all these other writers from the past and more recent writers. But what really turned me on to Matheson was his life story. And I started learning about his life in bits and pieces. I discovered that he was a socialist and very politically active on the left. I discovered that he was a gay man in a long-term relationship with a man 20 years his senior, who was also a visual artist. And I discovered that Matheson committed suicide in 1950, ostensibly for political reasons. And Matheson was a kind of role model for me at that moment in my life. I had just come out myself, and I was embarking on this academic path. And here's this sort of august gay father figure. But his life was also a cautionary tale because it ended tragically. And while I was studying Matheson, I was having a relationship with someone who was in many ways like him. It was a guy around my age who was a socialist, and he also suffered from bipolar disorder. And I became curious is not an adequate word, but I was aware of the fact that I was fascinated by this self-destructive gay figure from history. And here I was involved with another self-destructive young gay man. And sort of out of the coincidence of those two things, that coincidence in my intellectual and my personal life, the idea for this novel came about. And the novel is about a writer who has never really gotten over the first love of his life. And this writer has just written a book about F.O. Matheson, and there are parallels between the life of my protagonist and the life of F.O. Matheson, and that's played out throughout the novel.
The difference being Matheson actually did have a relationship with his partner, and your protagonist in some ways fantasized about the relationship that he has because it wasn't nearly as complete or equal.
That's right. The beloved in the novel is called Gregory, and my protagonist James and Gregory become best friends, and they become boyfriends. But it's a very rocky relationship, and in some ways not nearly as fulfilling as Matheson's actual relationship with his partner Russell Cheney. One of the things that is so powerful about Matheson's work is he and his partner Russell exchanged a lot of letters because they often lived separately. And those letters were published in the late 70s. And so we have this wonderful record of not only their relationship, but a record of how these two men, and they met in 1924, when there was not a very well-developed discourse around gay identity. So their letters really show these two people, Matheson in particular, who was the younger of the two, trying to articulate what is this thing that's happening in our lives? What is our relationship? Are we married? Do we tell other people about our relationship? If so, whom? Do we stay monogamous? So Matheson and Cheney are exploring all these questions in their letters. And that was another thing that was it was such good timing for me when I was in my early 20s, because, I practically never had a boyfriend before. So I didn't even know what that meant. And I didn't know what a relationship with another man looked like. And here's an example in Matheson and Cheney's letters. So in my novel, American Scholar, we watch James and Gregory, meeting and starting to develop feelings for each other and trying to have some kind of a relationship. And it's very reflective of what I was going through in my own life at that time.
And another difference, I guess, is that Gregory had experience. He had been in love before, he had relationships before. Whether they were successful or not is almost immaterial.
Yes.
But Jimmy or James really had not had those experiences before. He sort of had something before that, but it wasn't, once again, all that he thought that it might have been. It was something that was a lot less.
That's right.
And that's so right. Then you use New York as a character it's important where they walk. It's important where they live. It's important what they see and hear and smell. You weave that in a way that all the emotions that they're going through, all the things that they're going through are shadowed in a sense by what they're experiencing as the city itself changes over the time of James going from Jimmy to James and going from this infatuation with Gregory to his adult life.
That's right. That's right. The novel is structured in such a way that it alternates between the present, which in the novel is October 2016. It's 1 week before the election of Donald Trump, in fact. And there are several chapters that take place on just one night in October of 2016. And then there are extended flashbacks to the late 1980s. And so we see New York City in those two moments. There's a scene near the end of the novel where James, the protagonist, is taking a taxi through Lower Manhattan, and he catches a glimpse of One World Trade Center, which is the building that stands where the Twin Towers used to stand. And at that moment, he thinks about how much Gregory never got to see, because Gregory died in 1990. He died even before the first World Trade Center bombing, let alone 2001. And this sort of cascade of memories of contemporary history rushes through James's head. So the novel does, I think, show some ways in which New York City and the nation and the world has changed since the end of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. But you're right, New York is a vital presence in the novel. I love telling stories about people who are walking and talking in New York. It's sort of like those scenes in Woody Allen movies where people are just walking down the street and talking, but relating to their environment.
Right, and you use the apartment that Gregory lived in, or the house that Gregory lived in, as a very important focal point, because it's not only in the flashbacks, but it's an integral part when you come towards, and I don't want to go into the end of the book because people should really read this book, but it plays such a unique position, and so interestingly has changed so little that it makes it very clear to us where James is stuck and where he's getting loose, and his inability almost to walk away from the magnetism of that place because he's holding on so dearly to a past that he wants to believe was true.
That's right. That's right. That's a really good way to put it. Gregory lives in this very odd building on 29th Street in Manhattan, and it's a 19th century clapboard 3 or 4 story house, painted white with green shutters. And in my first apartment in New York City, I moved to the city in 1985, and I lived on 29th Street down the block from this very house. And I was always fascinated by this house because it looked like it belonged in some other state or in a small town. It was like, it literally looked like a farmhouse. And in the novel, everyone refers to it as the Little White Farmhouse. And I like the idea of putting Gregory there. You know, Gregory has, as you said, this magnetism and this power in some ways over Jimmy. And he also lives in this kind of magical place. When Jimmy first enters the courtyard of Gregory's building, he thinks that it's more like Paris than New York. There's a statue, and there's running water, and there's flowers, and it's just, you know, Jimmy is taken with so many aspects of Gregory's life, including the place where he lives. And place is very important for Jimmy. Later, James is thinking of writing a book about place. He wants to write a series of essays about places, important places in his life and in the life of the nation. But you're right, he's also stuck on this particular place, and he comes back almost like a stalker to that house in the contemporary chapters, and even wants to go inside, wishes he could just step inside one more time, be in Gregory's room one more time.
As if that would change anything.
As if that would change anything. That's right. That's right. Or as if that would reveal something. James operates under the illusion that there's something that Gregory still hasn't told him. And
like I love you.
Like I love you. Something that he needs to hear from Gregory. And that's one of the things that drives him throughout the whole novel.
But James becomes a successful man.
Yes.
And he becomes a professor, he becomes a writer, he's got his agent, and he's got a publisher, and he's got a
husband.
He's got a husband, he's got successful friends.
He's got a house in Brooklyn.
Right. So even with all that, there's a big piece missing.
Yeah. When you mention that, it reminds me of a passage in the novel where the adult James is remembering the 1 year anniversary of Gregory's death. And he organized a gathering of friends. And his idea was, we're all going to get together and we're going to talk about Gregory. We're going to remember Gregory. And he discovers that nobody wants to talk about Gregory. People have apparently started to, even 1 year after the guy's death, have started to move on. And there's a way in which James hasn't moved on and doesn't want to move on. He thinks he's moved on. But you discover over the course of the novel that he really hasn't.
And that is so true for so many people in the world that we live in, that when we don't address an issue, when we don't deal with crises, when we don't deal with trauma, we stay there. So your book, your characters are so reflective of where we are today, where we've always been as human beings, but particularly with the political world that we live in, because we're experiencing trauma to some extent on a daily basis, especially in the LGBTQ community, where the laws, and even if you're not in a state where the draconian laws are being put in place, as we are in Florida, you're aware of them. You're aware that Uganda passed the death penalty for gay people. You're aware that all of these things are going on. And when you're in that trauma, unless you find a way to process it, you end up like James, holding on to a past that really did not exist in the way he imagines it.
That's right. And that's a great connection that you're making with, current events and issues that affect the LGBTQ community. There are a couple of passages in the novel where James thinks about the upcoming election. It's going to happen in a week, and he's convinced that Hillary Clinton is going to win. And now he's certainly not alone. He wasn't alone in that. Lots and lots of people were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win. But that's just another sort of indication of how James is. He's not entirely living in the present. He's not seeing all there is to see in the present.
Now, going in a different direction, the inspiration came from what you were studying in school to some extent, and your fascination with a real person who was also an educator, a writer, a historian, who was in a relationship that was equally interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What other elements, what other shoulders are you standing on that made this book the way it is? What other influences?
Well, I think of literary influences. I've always been attracted to some of the high modernist writers like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Marcel Proust. And there's a lot of Virginia Woolf, especially, that has seeped into my writing. One of the ways I think that has happened is her novels minimize action so that she can really explore the minds of her characters. And the events of her novels are largely mental events, things that happen in people's minds and hearts. You know, her novel, Mrs. Dalloway, famously begins with Clarissa Dalloway walking through London. Her destination is a flower shop. She's going to buy some flowers for her party, but all the while she's thinking about her life, about her marriage, about her daughter, about how she feels about herself. And that's really what that novel is about. And you know, you mentioned the fact that in my novel, American Scholar, the protagonist, we see him walking the streets of New York in many different passages. And he is doing that, but he's also thinking about the book that he wants to write, the book that he's just written. He's thinking about Gregory, he's thinking about his husband, he's thinking about his boyfriend, etc. And so I learned a lot from studying Virginia Woolf. Also, I think of a novel like Ulysses by James Joyce. The whole novel takes place in one day, and it's the story of a man who's step by step on his way home to his wife, and he goes home at the end of the novel. And that's what happens in American Scholar. It's the story of a man who, starting around 7 p.m. in the evening, ultimately makes it home around 2 a.m. the next morning. And sort of minimizing the action in that way allows me to really explore the mind and the memories of this character and make the novel as layered as it is. So those are some literary influences. Also, James Baldwin figures into the novel in a number of different ways. The characters talk about Baldwin, they talk about Giovanni's room, they talk about his essays.
And why was that important to you? Because Baldwin is a very seminal figure in a period of American history, and certainly in LGBTQ history.
Absolutely.
So why Baldwin and not Gore Vidal? Why Baldwin and not somebody else?
I think Baldwin, well, it's it's hard to say succinctly why James Baldwin matters so much and why he matters to me. I love that his novel, Giovanni's Room, is tragic. I love that on the one hand, he gives us this beautiful, passionate relationship between David and Giovanni, but he doesn't sugarcoat it. And he shows David's failure to really save Giovanni. When I think of Baldwin's nonfiction, his essays, I often think of his essay, Notes of a Native Son, where he's exploring his relationship to his father. And there's a passage at the end of that essay, which comes up in my novel, where he talks about how we have to live with a contradiction, which is, on the one hand, we have to acknowledge that there's injustice and we have to fight injustice wherever we find it. On the other hand, we have to accept that injustice is part of human existence. And that sort of balance between fighting injustice and accepting the reality of injustice and the paradox of that, and having to live your life with that paradox. To me, that seems very mature, that seems very real. I remember in the 80s and early 90s when I was in ACT UP, that was another, I mean, when you talk about influences, that had a huge influence on the way I saw the world and the way I think and my critical thinking. But I remember often feeling that it was so hard for people in the AIDS activist movement to really cope with grief. And the actions that ACT UP undertook and the protests and the graphics and the attitude, in a way, it was always sort of pushing against the feelings that we were all having. And I understand why people had to do that. And that was part of what made ACT UP successful. But at the end of the day, you then come back and you've got all this loss to deal with. And it's not clear to me that protest and street activism is a way to deal with that.
It wasn't necessarily a way to deal with that, but it was certainly the only thing that was possible
Absolutely.
to address the crisis. So it's
absolutely,
that's certainly a dichotomy.
Yeah. And Baldwin captures that in a lot of his writing, both fiction and nonfiction.
And that period, the ACT UP period, is reflected in the book clearly, even if it's somewhat done through the eyes of people at Columbia, which is uptown, and that was downtown mostly. But it is interesting how all of these, you layer these things so beautifully, and they color the characters so well that you really do feel that you get to know them.
Mm.
And that is, I think, the sign of real good writing. When you feel that you know them. You may not like all of them, you might not like parts of them, but you know them and you feel that they're in your life.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad you felt that.
Pardon?
I'm glad you felt that about the characters.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly felt that I knew them, and I certainly was in New York at that time. And so I felt I knew the streets, I knew the buildings, I knew the quad at Columbia. So there were things that so for me, it was also became personal, but even for people who do not have those immediate experiences, it all comes alive so beautifully that I think that anybody who reads the book will find something in it for them. You introduced some of Gregory's family throughout the book, who did not live in New York. And why did you think that it was important for Jimmy to meet those people at those different times? And then towards the end of the book, which is, well, actually towards the beginning of the book, he runs into Gregory's sister again, who comes to the reading of his book on Matheson, which is seminal to the entire storyline, which you don't know necessarily when you're introduced to it, but as the story goes on, and that's why I say you just want to refer back, because now I see this. It's just so well done. So why the?
Well, I think when we tell stories about LGBT people, we often have to take into account their families and their families of origin, because that is often, those families have such a shaping influence on the person and the life story, for better and for worse. We don't know much about Jimmy's family. There's a reference to his father, to his sister, there's a nephew or two in there, a niece. I don't really get into it too much, and I didn't want to get bogged down in sort of family drama. But with Gregory, I think part of it was wanting to show how Jimmy, repeatedly throughout the novel misjudges and misperceives things, and first and foremost Gregory. And one of the things that Jimmy discovers when he meets Gregory's sister and brother-in-law and his two nephews is that they're wonderful people. They're terrific people. They're really nice. They're supportive. Yeah, they're straight. Yeah, they're suburban. They're not living in New York. They're not on the front lines of the AIDS epidemic like Jimmy and Gregory and their friends are, but these are decent people, and they care about Gregory, and they're interested in Jimmy. They want to know about his research. And it's one of many instances where we see that Jimmy is rather naive. He's inexperienced. He latches on to certain ideas without fully thinking them through. Also, as you mentioned, the older sister ends up, coming to James's reading, and she gives him an envelope with his name on it in Gregory's hand. And James holds this envelope in his breast pocket throughout the entire novel. And it's not until the end of the novel that he musters up the courage to open it. And she also gives him a book that he had once given to Gregory. She returns it to him. So, there's a kind of plot device in there, but also, again, you see that she was a decent person and she loved her brother, and she may not have fully understood his life and what was going on with him, but she's not the enemy, and his family was not the enemy.
No,
and that makes us think that James's family is also probably not the enemy, even though he has a very prickly relationship to them. It's not so simple.
It was also interesting because they got to Gregory's family while they were going on an expedition for writing James's book.
That's right. Jimmy is doing Matheson research, and he drags Gregory along with him. And Gregory says, well, let's stay with my sister because she lives in Connecticut. We're going to Boston, so it's on the way. Yeah.
So there's going into one thing that takes you into another thing as they go in and explore, and they go to other places other than Boston as well, looking for the symbols and traits that will give him some insight into this person that he's studying and writing about.
Right, and Jimmy is particularly fascinated, maybe you would say morbidly fascinated by Matheson's suicide, and he wants to find the hotel where Matheson died. Matheson jumped out of the window of a hotel in 1950, and Jimmy wants to find the hotel. He wants to find the spot where the body fell, and Jimmy thinks that this is some way of getting into Matheson's head and understanding his psychology. Gregory, on the other hand, is slightly appalled by this, and he goes along with it, but he's uncomfortable with it. And they even have an argument at one point where Gregory says to him, you never tried to kill yourself. You don't know what you're talking about. I, on the other hand, I did, and I do know what this is about. And to me, it's not just some intellectual game I'm playing.
Yeah, it's not a puzzle.
That's right. It's my life.
And the whole thing with the hotel being changed.
The hotel's not there. It was torn down years ago. And this is before the internet. It's before Google. It's before Google Maps. So they have an old map of the North End, and they discover, to their disappointment, that the hotel was demolished. But they meet a man who's now a bartender who used to be a bellboy at the hotel, and he's able to fill in some of the history. And this actually happened. I did take a couple of expeditions to Boston in search of Matheson, and I did go in search of that hotel, and I did meet a bartender at a nearby pub who told me about the hotel and what it was like. So there's so much that's personal in this book, even though it's fiction.
Well, isn't that true for many writers, that even when it is seemingly distant, it still pulls from what you know and who you are? And
yes, that is absolutely true. In the case of this novel, I had actually written a version of this book about 20 years ago as a memoir. And I wasn't entirely satisfied with it because the kind of mysterious figure in the story was me. People who read it, it was about this friend that I had, and then it was about Matheson, and people would read it and they say, the person I really can't wrap my mind around in this book is you. I don't really know who you are in this, even though you're the narrator. It's your story. And I put that memoir aside for about 15 years. And then in the meantime, I had started writing fiction. And once I felt confident as a fiction writer, I thought, well, maybe I can totally revamp this memoir as a novel. And what I found is that the character that's based on me, which is the protagonist, Jimmy, I really made it his story. And I made the crux of the novel something that's going on in his mind and in his heart. And that seemed to kind of bring all the pieces together.
And because it was fiction, it made it easier?
Yes, because it allowed me to eliminate a lot of things that, when I was writing it as a memoir, seemed absolutely important to me. For example, and this isn't giving anything away, but the particular way in which my friend died, that was always something that I clung to as an essential part of the story. And I realized at a certain point, the character based on my friend, the character in the novel whose name is Gregory, his end doesn't have to be the same end as my friend's end. And there were a lot of other things about the story that I realized I can change this, because even though it's true, it's standing in the way of the real story that I'm trying to tell.
So when you say the real story, what do you mean the real story versus
the factual story?
Exactly.
Which is a very transcendental notion, by the way. It's very Emersonian, the idea that the real is not what's evident. It's not what you can touch and what you sense. I mean, that's true in a certain way, but it's not real with a capital R. It's a very transcendental notion. The real story for me is who James is, and why he has this fixation with his friend Gregory, and why he's never been able to get over that, even though he, as you mentioned, he's moved on in so many ways in his life. He's a high functioning, successful person. But on the inside, he's still worshiping at the shrine of this friend who died 25 years ago. Why is that?
So it's also interesting from that perspective that you started a memoir 15 years before you wrote the book. And when we pick up the story in the beginning, he's writing his dissertation on Matheson, which becomes American Scholar.
That's right.
So many, 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 many years later, maybe even more years later than what it took you to write the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet he obviously has done many things in between.
Yes. Yes.
What would make him go back to that book? What made you go back to that memoir?
That's a great question. Part of it I think had to do with Matheson. I always felt like I didn't do Matheson justice. I wrote my dissertation on F.O. Matheson. For a while, I thought I was going to write a biography of Matheson. I thought I might do a new edition of his letters with Russell Cheney. I started meeting some of his descendants. I started meeting Cheney's descendants. And I got really absorbed into their world. But and this is where I realized in some ways I'm not an academic. I got a PhD. I traveled an academic path. I taught literature for 30 years and I loved it. But the writing I've done is not traditional scholarly writing. And part of it is that I always felt just so overwhelmed by the burden of responsibility, like taking on a figure like F.O. Matheson. He's a major figure and his life points in so many different directions. And so I felt I never did full justice to him, and I had done all this research on him that was just sort of left hanging. So that was one reason why I wanted to come back to the memoir and see if I could rewrite it as fiction. But also, as I said, I felt like there was something that I hadn't resolved in the story that I was telling when it was a memoir, and I wanted to see if I could solve that.
Now, is that the same motivation for Jimmy?
That's a good question. Maybe. James has just published a novel on the life of F.O. Matheson. It's called American Scholar. So the novel within the novel is called American Scholar. And the next book as I mentioned, the next book he wants to write is a series of essays on place in American culture. And he thinks that he's finished with the book that was really inspired by his relationship with Gregory. But at a certain point in the novel, he decides, hey, I could write an essay about the place where Gregory lived and include that in my next book. So he just keeps coming back to Gregory. He can't get enough of Gregory. And I guess to some extent that has been true for me with the person that inspired that character. But yeah. And also it makes me think about, when someone dies whom you loved, and not just someone you loved, but someone who you feel in some ways helped you become the person you are, helped you fulfill your potential as a person, someone who helped form you. For a lot of people, it's their parents who do that. But and not to say my parents didn't have that sort of impact on me. Of course they did, but the friend that the character of Gregory is based on had a really outsized impact on my life. And to lose him when he was 30 years old, it's just like, you never catch your breath from something like that, or at least I never did.
And at that stage, was that the first serious love? Not the first love, but the first serious love?
Oh, absolutely. It was. I learned there's a passage in the novel where Jimmy is attending a reading group of gay men. It's a gay men's study group, and it's his first time there. And the leaders of the group are introducing themselves, and as Jimmy is listening, he's thinking to himself, aha, so this is how gay men talk. This is how they hold themselves. I mean, his questions about his identity are so basic. And that's that partly explains why the loss of this person was so hard to get around.
Right, because it informed everything.
Everything.
How to be gay, how to be a man, how to be in love.
How exactly.
Even though
How to
that
have an
love was not necessarily reciprocated.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, I think there's a part in the novel where Jimmy alludes to their relationship, and Gregory sort of is almost surprised that Jimmy feels that way.
Well, they have a number of serious arguments throughout the novel, and there's a moment where Jimmy is in the doghouse and Gregory doesn't want anything to do with him, but Jimmy keeps coming back and tries to seduce him at one point, and Gregory says to him, "What are you doing? Like, you know, we're not boyfriends anymore. You're not allowed to do that." And then he softens and they do become involved again, but it's a very rocky relationship for sure.
But and sometimes that makes someone like you more. And yeah, it seems like for Jimmy, that's something he could not have made him want it more than anything.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I'm sure that's true. That's true. And as you mentioned, Gregory already had a significant boyfriend, and there's a way in which that person, whose name is Bill, and Bill is a major character in the novel. Bill was to Gregory what Gregory was to Jimmy. Jimmy doesn't realize that until much later in the novel, but Gregory also had that kind of figure in his life, who was this other person, Bill.
But you also, in our conversation, we talked about the ups and downs and the tragedy and the traumas and all of that, and Gregory plays a unique role in that from the very first time Jimmy is introduced to Gregory or sees Gregory is this almost ephemeral figure. Mm-hmm. People are drawn to his words, even though he may not be 100% coherent at that particular moment. He's speaking in tongues. Oh, everybody must listen to what he has to say. And his hair falls into his face. And as we talked before, he's sort of a Jesus-like figure. He's charismatic. He's somewhat messy. He carries a very heavy load because of his mental issues, his mental health. Maybe he's not carrying the weight of the world, but he's carrying the weight of a lot of other people who have invested in him. Yeah. And then he dies young.
Yeah. Well, and he organized in the novel, and this was also true of my friend who is the inspiration for the character. Gregory has organized this gay men's reading group, and it's a place for gay men to socialize and to get to know each other without the presence of alcohol. And that's significant when you think about the gay community and the places where we meet and what we do together when we come together.
Especially at that period of time.
Especially at that period of time, that's right. And he's the hub of this social network, and Jimmy immediately feels like he's kind of stumbled into this whole wonderful new world. But as you said, Gregory is messy and he's troubled. At the first meeting that Jimmy attends, Gregory plays a song by the Smiths, and he attempts to parse it out and analyze it, and he gets lost in his ideas and his words, and he starts to cry, and other people have to kind of come to his rescue and prop him up, or so it seems to Jimmy, because the next minute Gregory's laughing and joking, and then Jimmy thinks, well, maybe I misunderstood what just happened.
And the whole conversation about Morrissey.
Yes.
And the way Gregory looked at that. And then Jimmy has to wonder if he even understands music.
That's right.
Because they're talking about these things that he never could have thought of.
That's right. That's right.
How deep they went in the lyrics and the positions and what they were saying. And oh, wow, I just thought it was music.
Yeah. Gregory makes a speech in that scene where he says, you know, you have people like Elton John and Michael Jackson and Prince, and you have these you know, really successful, arguably gay men out there making pop music, but their music isn't speaking to us as gay men. And he turns to Morrissey and he says, you know, Morrissey is much more interesting. His politics may be a little harder to identify, but he seems to be speaking about the issues that at least Gregory feels are worth speaking about. And the song that he plays, Reel Around the Fountain, appears to be a song about some kind of abuse between two young men who have some kind of erotic relationship. And Gregory is attracted to that in the song and wants to talk about that, and finds it difficult to talk about, but he does that. And James is attracted to that because Gregory's smart. You know, he's not going to settle for just a kind of simple prescription for how to make things better. He wants to kind of get into the muck. But there's danger.
He also wants to see what's under the surface.
Yes.
Whereas many of the other people in the room didn't have the patience for that. You're reading into this. Don't read into something
right.
that's just
He may not even be singing about another man. He could be singing about a girl.
Right. And he has an answer for that. And you'll have to read the book to know what the answer is, because it's a good answer, and one that in this day and age is appropriate, since we're in today's world, we are reviewing what the words mean, what a pronoun means, what a man is, what a woman is, what all the other definitions for people that fall under the rainbow flag are. And this was before those conversations to some extent. And yet you could almost see those conversations beginning.
Oh, yeah.
Even all the way back in the 80s, how new words were defining who people were, how people saw themselves, what a relationship was.
Well, in that same scene, a guy raises his hand and he says something like, you know, the book they're reading, they're discussing an academic book that he feels is too white male centric. And he says, you know, not every gay guy is white, not every gay guy is middle class, not every gay guy is a refugee in the big city. He said, you know, I want to get married. And everybody in the room bursts out laughing. And he's like, hey, it's not funny. It could happen someday. And I remember in the 80s, when discussions of marriage would come up in the mid 80s, thinking, wow, this is like from some other planet. Why are we talking about this? Who the fuck cares? Sorry, who cares? Don't we have more important things to worry about? And it seemed like such not even a fantasy that you would desire. It seemed so irrelevant to me and to a lot of the people that I was associating with at that time. But, you know, look what happened. And that wasn't so long ago.
Not so long ago. Well, to some people it is, but
yeah.
And in those days, nobody was talking about serving openly in the military.
No.
And no one was really talking about adopting children.
No.
So the progress that is made from where your story begins chronologically to where it ends, when even the subject of children enters the picture, was something that was unfathomable.
Yeah.
Where James's life starts in this novel. And to cover that ground so subtly as you do really makes you think, at least for me, how much we have to pay attention if we want to know what's going on around us. The Jimmies in us can look at something and just not see it.
Yeah.
The Gregorys feel everything to the point where it's too painful to feel it.
Yeah.
And where is the place where those things come together and we find a certain balance within our communities, within our lives, within our world? That's a lot to do in a book that is not, 1,000 pages, that basically primarily is two character focused.
Yeah.
And I think that intimacy of working with two characters through the eyes of one character, but with enough information to give you the information that you need about the second character, makes it so personal. And I think that if people who are watching and people who will watch this when it goes up live on our YouTube channel after we're finished, will live with this book for a long time, because it hits on some very strong emotional notes, and you really get to feel moments of history that shows that history never goes away. We're living those moments, even though times change. Humanity and our being humans and who we are doesn't change quite so much.
Yeah.
So without giving anything away, would you say that there is some kind of resolution by the end, or would you say that some things that are just stay the same?
I love French film, because French movies often end with irresolution, and they often end abruptly and suddenly. I don't think American Scholar ends abruptly or suddenly, but I would say the end forces the reader to hopefully do a lot of thinking. I think James comes to some realizations at the end of the novel. That much I will say. How that makes you feel, I don't know.
No, and certainly, as you say, it does come to an end because he gets home. So from that perspective, there's a real ending.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily, as you said, it's French noir kind of.
It's not tied up in a bow, exactly.
Right, exactly. It's not a finished. It's not a finished ending.
Well, because life doesn't work that way,
and nor should it.
Right. I mean, there's going to be another day after the day we just witnessed in the novel, and so you should have a sense of that, I think.
Yes, and New York isn't going away anytime soon either, and that is the third lead character in the book.
That's right. Yes.
On that note, we are coming to the end. I really want to thank you. I want to thank your publisher for sending the book for us to read and to schedule this time to talk with you. It was a real pleasure. Once again, the book is American Scholar. It's by Patrick Horrigan. It's available and so well worth reading. It would be a good summer book to read. It would be a good winter book to read as we change seasons. They experience a lot of seasons in there, even though the span of the time that we're with them is relatively short. Once again, I'm Robert Kesten, Executive Director of Stonewall National Museum, Archives, and Library. This book will be in our library, so anybody who's in the Fort Lauderdale area can come and take it out. If you're a member of the museum, we have a lot of other programs and projects that are happening in the near future. Soon, our Pride exhibits will go up in the museum, so hopefully people will be able to come in and see them. We have discussions, we have lectures, we We have things online. We have things live. Make this your home when you're not at home. This place is for our community to learn its history, to share in its culture, and to make it so that we understand why history does indeed equal pride, because we have a lot to be proud of in terms of what our community has added to the national and international culture, to business, to academia, to science, and to life. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Patrick, for being a part of this.
Thank you, Robert, so much.
This will go up on the YouTube, excuse me, the YouTube channel. And please have your friends come and check it out. It's hopefully was a good conversation for you as much as it was for us. Thank you and have a good night.
Thanks, Robert.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.